Will do, Annie, and thank you, ma'am. So we have a wonderful panel today. The title is Enabling Equitable Disaster Assistance Key Policy Initiatives. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and get a little bit about their background. First, I'll introduce myself. My name's Mike Sprayberry. I am the former director of the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management and the director of the Office of Recovery and Resiliency. I can tell you that my passion is affordable housing and increasing the portfolio of affordable housing, as well as making sure that our disaster programs are implemented in an equitable manner, because we all know that they're not. And so we gotta fix that. We got the right people on here to work towards that end. And so, Laurie Showman, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Mike. And it's really wonderful to be here with everyone today. Thank you, Annie, for inviting me. Good to see so many great friends and colleagues on the call. So I am with an organization called Enterprise Community Partners. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary year, working a nation to build, protect, advocate, and finance affordable housing. I work in Capital Division. I lead our climate and sustainability work. Enterprise is, as I said, work across the nation. We have 11 offices that work on the solutions for communities that are critical to accelerating affordable housing. And we work on a variety of issues, from homelessness prevention to implementation of fair housing, to ensuring that communities are able to deal with the issues that are particular to them. In my role at Enterprise, leading Capital, our climate and sustainability work for Capital, we understand that the impact from disaster into our communities is significant. It destabilizes the assets we have, the investments we make, the communities that depend on safe and sound housing. And so what we're trying to do, and what one of my moonshots is, to establish a way to get ahead of these risks by financing affordable housing and communities in a way that will help to create resilient housing and communities. And so we know that we can no longer wait until the next disaster happens before we act to accelerate protection of affordable housing. And so what I'm going to bring into the conversation today is the connection between housing stability, community stability, and the need for financing and enabling structures and programs to support sustainability. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to diving in.
Thanks, Laurie. And next to my old friend, Dan Kanuski.
Hey, Mike, and thank you. Hello, everybody from London. Just wanted to make sure that we're representing every possible time zone here. I find myself in London today. So I guess I'm Dan Kanuski, former Deputy Administrator for Resilience at FEMA. I had the opportunity to work with many of you in that role. Of course, Mike was, I don't know if you mentioned that, Mike, but you were the State Director of North Carolina, where you were able to not only talk about many of these things, but implement many of these really wonderful resilience programs. So I'm delighted to be here, also with Laurie and Annie. Thank you for having me today. So in my current role at Marsh McLennan, which is the world's largest commercial insurance brokerage, I have the opportunity to talk about how we insure to get broader resilience priorities. For those that know FEMA, you know that FEMA has the National Flood Insurance Program, which I had the pleasure to oversee. And both what I saw during my time at FEMA and in my current role for the past 2.5 years, I really do believe that there's a combination of risk management, such as hazard mitigation and any other physical protection measures you can put in place to reduce your risk, that there's a direct connection between that which is the financial protection from disasters. The key, and I think for the topic today, the key is to make sure that communities and individuals and households can access those programs, can access them, whether it means the ability to get to those programs, or if it's a federal program, it's very confusing to figure out how to access those programs, as well as to be able to afford those programs. Again, whether it's a federal insurance program like an NFIP, or a commercial or residential insurance, or investments into hazard mitigation. So that's really what I look forward to talking about today. And again, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dan. We'll jump. Is Simone on yet?
I do not see her name quite yet. So Mike, if you just want to continue on and we'll loop her in when she gets settled. Thanks.
Roger that. We'll drive on. Okay, so my first question is as follows. Our nation is experiencing acute affordable housing shortages that are worsening with every year. As a former state emergency management director in North Carolina, our top priority was to increase the amount of affordable housing out of the flood zone. Across North Carolina, we knew there was a shortage of close to 200,000 rental homes that are affordable and available to extremely low income households. We found it was extremely difficult to incentivize construction of new affordable homes. It's an issue for both renters and families interested in becoming homeowners, and we know it's an issue across the country. How can we work with different disciplines, government agencies, and the private sector to develop solutions to mitigate this problem? And we'll start with you, Laurie.
Thanks, Mike. I almost would recommend we have an entire conference to discuss this. Very excellent question. I want to give everyone a landscape of what's going on with the affordable housing crisis around the nation, and then let's dig in a little bit to the question, Mike. So everyone, if you're reading the news, even as today, there's a massive amount of media coverage on the issues around rising interest rates, housing starts stopping, and increasingly we're seeing a cool down in the housing sector. But we're not seeing that for the affordable housing sector. We're seeing that there's more demand for affordable housing than ever before. We're not seeing the amount of affordable housing created at the speed in which it needs to be created to provide for our nurses, our teachers, our fire workers, our first line supports, our volunteers. So every unit counts. We look at what's happening in coastal zones. We look at what's happening in the fire zones. A lot of these housing starts and housing units are on the edge of the communities because often that's where the land was cheapest to build affordable housing. What's happening now is we're seeing an erosion, quite literally, of this affordable housing because of the climate impacts and risks that are growing larger. So we need to do two things. We need to build more affordable housing, and we need to ensure that our existing affordable housing is up to code and protected and preserved. And the White House has just initiated a really amazing effort, along with FEMA and other agencies, to ensure that code compliance is in place for housing. I would argue that much of our affordable housing stock is older. It is there is not enough reserve to repair a lot of this housing and bring it up to code. So we need to have set asides to support this housing and to make sure it's code compliant and safe and resilient. We need to go beyond code and think about all the different ways that we can bring in best practice resiliency. How do we ensure that there's a flood standard in the nation for housing? The opportunity to bring resiliency forward often presents itself after disasters. So Mike, in all of the work that many of you across the nation are doing after disaster, think about when you're rebuilding, building it not only to code, but beyond code. And we have some tools that we'll pass around after the event to help you think about that. And then before we start, before we're at an event or crisis point, what ways can we bring forward and carry forward resilient best practices and fund it? I am particularly excited by the funding coming forward from the federal government right now in the infrastructure bill. While there is no set aside for housing, we need to make sure that the funding that is coming forward for weatherization, et cetera, is used for the purpose of fortifying our housing stock. Because here's the thing, and here's where I'm going to close. As a taxpayer, I don't want to keep footing the bill to clean up disaster after disaster and rebuild in the same way we've been rebuilding. Because what's happening is we're creating repeated losses that are not helping our cash flow as a nation. And so we need to think about smart investments, making sure that our assets and our investments are going to be able to preserve and be protected for generations. It just makes common sense. It's fiscal common sense. Thank you, Mike, for that question.
Thanks, Lori. Dan, your comments on that?
Yeah, let me start by saying this, like many of the topics we'll discuss today, are not something the federal government alone can solve. You know, there isn't a silver bullet here from the federal government where the federal government would just wave a wand and say, we fixed it. We fixed the policy. We fixed the program. Right? It's not going to happen. This is as a former Fed guy, I can tell you that. So let's not count on the federal government to fix this problem. So as we acknowledge that, we say, well, what can we do? Well, the solution, it's a bunch of buzzwords, you know, public-private partnerships and really, you know, collaboration amongst different industries. Those are actually our best options, right? So rather than just use the term public-private partnership, what do I mean by that? Well, I'll give you one idea. So at my firm, we did some thought leadership on this, and we call it community-based catastrophe insurance. And you can Google that, kind of a mouthful, CBCI for short, but community-based catastrophe insurance. Essentially what we're proposing is that communities can purchase insurance on behalf of community members, right? That does two things. One, it makes it more affordable because you're buying essentially a group policy. Just like you buy your health insurance as a group policy, it'd be much more expensive to buy on your own. But if you buy as a group policy through your employer, for example, it's at a discounted rate. Apply that now to property and casualty insurance. If a community buys insurance together, the rate should be lower, right? Well, that's step one, or that's one way to kind of reduce the cost. And the insurance could be flood insurance, for example, or it could be earthquake insurance, or it could be anything you can imagine to reduce that financial burden on those who are impacted by disaster. So one, group policy. Two, pair that insurance with something that's going to reduce the cost of the insurance. Maybe said a little bit differently, pair it with something that's going to reduce the risk profile to that community. And that's kind of a tortured way of saying what? That those of us in the emergency management world call hazard mitigation, right? So by pairing hazard mitigation with insurance, you're going to see the synergy immediately in a reduction in premium. So CBCI says basically, we can make that insurance more affordable to the point where maybe even a community, a government, let's say a local government, may want to purchase that and pay for it on behalf of the community. Because that community sees that government sees that is an investment that's going to have a high return on investment, right? By investing in mitigation, which, oh, by the way, can be paid for partially by state and local government, state and federal governments, right? So the federal government does have a role to play. They can't fix the problem on its own. They don't have a solution. They can't wave that magic wand, but they could potentially fund a community-based solution, whether it be hazard mitigation or any of the other risk reduction measures. And that will make that insurance more affordable. And this was thought leadership. We wrote it, a year and a half, 2 years ago, put it out there as an idea. Would you believe a couple of communities came forward and said, you know what, that sounds really interesting. We'd like to pilot that. And since then, we've looked at a few different communities, one of which is Paradise. So I know Lori mentioned wildfire. We looked at the town of Paradise and said, how could this investment in hazard mitigation paired with insurance drop premiums to the point where, one, insurance is affordable, but even take a step back, available. There are certainly communities in California, the highest risk wildfire is in California, that can't even get insurance. So How does it suddenly become available and affordable? By reducing the risk. How do you reduce the risk? It could be traditional hazard mitigation, like we've kind of talked about, or it could be nature-based solutions. It could be creating a buffer. And this, I don't mean to oversimplify it, but it could be as simple as a buffer zone around your home, reducing that risk profile. And as a part of that follow-on study, I'm going to leave you with one last statistic on this topic, which is we found that by pairing something that Lori mentioned, which was building codes, a strong building code. So a community needs to have strong building codes. I feel passionate about that, by the way. I'm on the National Institute of Building Sciences Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council, and we believe strongly in strong building codes. So pair strong building codes with a nature-based solution like a buffer zone and other areas. We found that you can reduce the insured losses by 40%. And if you can reduce the insured losses by 40%, you're suddenly going to have insurers that are willing to insure the property and do so hopefully at a more affordable price. Lori?
Dan, I just want to respond really quickly. This is where policy comes in. So we're working with we're working with state insurance
Commissioners.
agencies to look at this for multifamily housing, Dan, because without that policy lever, we're not going to get anything done. We've got to not only work on what you're discussing, but plus it up by having a policy play here, because
Absolutely.
We can't get anything done without the insurance commissioners at the state level. Then I think there's a real opportunity here. I agree with you.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. As I said, this started as thought leadership. It kind of transitioned into a couple pilot projects that we've now published. You can see it on, Google it and find it. We did it jointly with the Nature Conservancy, by the way. So it was Marsh McLennan and the Nature Conservancy that produced that report, that wildfire report. And yes, Lori's absolutely right, which is to take it from a pilot to policy would take buy-in from the state insurance commissioners, because insurance is regulated at the state level. And unfortunately, it is every state, on its own. But there's a National Association of Insurance Commissioners, Lori, where I'm sure you're engaging to make sure that it becomes a model, right? So that all 50 states can see that as a model, and they each have to choose on their own if they're going to adopt it. But the hope is that whether it's what we're doing or what anybody's doing in this space, we can generate enough interest and show that it works, that we get the policymakers on board to embrace it and make it the law of the land.
Yep. It'll unlock the capital we need to make those resiliency investments. It's the thing that will move the market. Absolutely, Dan.
Right. And thanks for that, Dan. And I tell you, what y'all are talking about really highlights a big issue, a big obstruction, and how we can move forward to ensure there's more affordable housing and more protection against catastrophe, severe weathers. And that's the fact that we typically work in silos in government. And so your emergency management director is typically not going to be working closely with the insurance commissioner. And he or she may not be working closely with private sector. And so we've got to tear down those barriers if we want to make some good progress. And so, but loved your comments. And we have Simone with us now. And Simone, if you could introduce yourself to the gang here, and then I'm going to put you on the spot, ask you a question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Simone Davis, and I am the school founder of Kingdom Come International. I am CEO of Black Towns Municipal Management, so the former town manager of Tallahassee, Oklahoma. And I am a current doctoral student in the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California. And it's just kind of the hearing this conversation so far, it's so timely to I'm actually in Los Angeles right now, and conversations around policy and implementation, and even the disconnect of how to, I would say on the community level, how important policy making is, and understanding the intricacies of getting something implemented in government. And so I wear a number of hats, and they all kind of intersect in this space of resiliency for Black communities. And alongside that, I'm a creative, and I would love for you all to look up on YouTube this project that I just finished as executive producer, and it's called More Money. And MORE stands for Mayors Organized for Reparations and Equity. And it's kind of to the point where we are right now in discussing Tallahassee. And so a year ago, I was able to help Tallahassee join this national coalition co-founded by the mayor of Los Angeles and the mayor of Denver. And 11 US founding mayors sits on this coalition from Sacramento to Kansas City to St. Louis to Durham, North Carolina to Tallahassee, Oklahoma. And so it's kind of one of those niche rares. How does Tallahassee and who is Tallahassee? And I think that kind of started the national conversation around all Black towns. And Oklahoma currently has the most operational all Black towns still in existence. And so that's kind of the mission, and working in resiliency in that way, and understanding Black townships, land ownership, municipal management when it comes to the future for creating sustainability for families to relocate. And Tallahassee was featured in the Washington Post a couple months ago around, again, this concept of reparations, but not only that, but resiliency and sustainability. What does it mean to take something that has been here for generations? Tallahassee is the oldest all Black town in the state of Oklahoma, and it was incorporated as a town before Oklahoma was even a state. And you have some instances in other Black towns that has that founding or incorporation date. But yet, if you were to ever visit any of these townships, you see them highly, just, there's so much to do. It's interesting when you visit these townships and realize the resiliencies of just staying alive or just surviving in bare minimum. And so there's been more of a national recognition of Black townships and how to rebuild them for the future.
Simone, I have a question for you. So in North Carolina, we have the town of Princeville, which is the oldest town incorporated by African Americans in the United States. It was established by freed slaves after the Civil War and incorporated in 1885. It suffered from repetitive flooding due to tropical storms many times, and has a very low capacity to manage disaster assistance programs. In other words, they've got a lot of awards of different disasters programs, everything from hazard mitigation to community development block grants for disaster recovery and mitigation and hazard mitigation and state appropriations. I'm talking millions and millions and millions of dollars. So money's not the problem. The problem is they have a distinct lack of capacity. So it's really hard to take that money and then, head off in the right direction with it. So can you provide us with your perspective on what resilience means to communities like Tallahassee, Princeville, and others? What do practitioners and academics need to know about the communities, and what assumptions do we need to overcome?
Thank you for that question. I think it really starts at a level of research and understanding what townships mean to Black communities and Black families. And speaking of low capacity, I think that's one of the reasons I had to resign as town manager and then take a step back and scale. It's like take a step back to scale up. And I apologize if you hear, this is the LA streets, if you hear the sirens in the background. But there is a tendency to overlook the research and development of what it takes to create a sustainable community, instead of just I want to say throwing dollars of funding at a particular issue. And so when it comes to academics and practitioners, it's not only, of course, the partnerships within the municipalities of these towns, but I would say the collaboration across. So it's not just looking at a silo of Princeville or Tallahassee, but recognizing what are townships, how long have they been around? What does it mean to create a sustainable future, and not just, I would say, rectifying a silo issue. And these are conversations, and as you mentioned, it's kind of like the low capacity of, these are conversations that I feel like that are happening in separate rooms. And how are we able to overlap? One of the reasons why Black Towns Municipal Management was created, and Dr. Tia Martin, based in Boston, and I created a GIS mapping tool of US Black towns. And the website to go and check that out, and I can put it in the chat, is nextleads.org/Black towns. And you will see again that I think that there needs to be some type of centralized communication, not decentralized, and not everyone working in their own community, but recognizing what's happening in this community and how are we ever able to leverage for a national conversation, and grouping together, rather than saying that you are just a separate town with separate issues. Princeville, you're in it on your own. But no, Princeville may have the same, and again, talking about like the floodplains, may have the same situations as townships in Mississippi, Black townships in Georgia. And so I think that it's kind of leveraging that conversation, and then the collaboration across, and not just deep.
Thank you, Simone. And sort of leading on from this, I'm kind of talking about low capacity. And, I got to tell you, if you look at America across the nation, so many counties are rural in nature, and they are low capacity. And so you can give them as much money as you want. They are going to have a hard time doing BCAs and working hazard mitigation programs and figuring out how to synergize all these different programs with other agencies, because some towns don't even have full-time employees, and so it's just crazy. So my next question for all of you is, FEMA Administrator Chris Willis said that climate change is our country's biggest crisis. With the historic $3.46 billion awarded last August, with another $1 billion in BRIC funding, the nation now has more hazard mitigation funding than ever. There has not been a corresponding increase of state and local capacity to administer the program. What are your programmatic recommendations to ensure that this funding is awarded and implemented in a rapid and equitable manner in order to assist disaster survivors? So we'll start with you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And it was a pleasure to be at the beginning stages of BRIC. It was the 2017 hurricanes where we got BRIC from, right? Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and all the questions about what can we do to reduce disaster impacts in the future, that really germinated that what is now really blossomed into a wonderful and very large program. And it's great to see that. Now, at the same time, the program was developed quickly. It was developed to get money out the door as fast as possible. And, hindsight is 2020, that, there were ways that the program could have been developed to ensure for more equitable distribution of funds. But you know what? I think this administration, as they've taken, leadership on both climate change and on ensuring that all disaster funds are distributed in an equitable way, are really improving on what we started, right? They've seen it play out for better, for worse, mostly for better, right? Funding is getting out to communities. That's great. And you're talking about billions of dollars. So it's not, but it's billions more than was available before. But I think what you saw last year was that those communities that maybe need it most either weren't able to apply for it because they didn't have the capacity, as Mike said, or maybe didn't even know about it. There was a real lack of public education around this. It was surprising because, Mike heard me talk about BRIC ad nauseum for what, 2 years? He was getting sick of me saying it. But the thing was, we were talking to emergency managers about it. And as Mike said earlier, it's not always the case that emergency managers are perfectly synced up at all levels of government with every community organization or even every agency. And so when you bring in the housing agencies, and we talked about insurance, bring in the insurance commissioners, and you bring in the community organizations, then you really see a groundswell of interest and support, and the word gets out. And once the word gets out, then you need to provide the support so that those communities can apply for those grants. So I saw obviously what FEMA did last year. There was some pushback about the grants not getting to the right place for the reasons we just talked about. I liked what I saw. Administrator Criswell reacted immediately and said, for this round of BRIC, there's going to be additional technical assistance available for those for those disadvantaged communities that need it. And so that was good. It was a good step in the right direction. She immediately acknowledged the problem and immediately offered a partial solution. I say partial because that's not the silver bullet, right? Providing more technical assistance. There's still going to be far more demand than there is supply of technical assistance, which is just a fancy way of saying FEMA assisting a local community in their application process, right? So what does that mean going forward? It means that we need to build that local capacity building at the lowest level possible, ideally right at the community level, to help now that hopefully these communities are aware of the grants, but now to hopefully to beyond just, again, the federal solution of technical assistance, foster technical assistance, foster community interest. It's almost redundant, a community of interest at the community level. And I think, Simone, by you have your feet in both camps here, right? You understand the emergency management side, but you also understand how to mobilize a community. So I think someone like you and your group could really mobilize interest in this and potentially even help to offer some level of technical assistance to these communities in need, give them the basics of, the basic understanding of how they access it. For example, BRIC funding is accessed at the state level, right? It's the state that has to sign off on it. So ultimately you have to work with the state. Simone, how many community organizations have strong connections to the state? Probably not a lot. If it's a local community, they may not have that access. They may not have that connection, that relationship, but I bet you do. And I bet those like yourself that are members of your organization could provide those critical links between that local community and the Mike Sprayberries of the world, the state directors.
Agreed, wholeheartedly agree. I think that was, so my previous background, I have 2 masters and one of them is in education and teach English as a second language, but I have a certificate in international advocacy and leadership. And at the root of becoming town manager, it was a complete career shift, number one, but it stemmed out of advocacy. And it evolved out of this root cause of access and lack of knowing how to leverage relationships within the state, so state level, yes, and federal. And so quickly it was the things that the mayor tried to succeed or tried to accomplish in her town, not simple, but like things where I can send emails or phone conversations or leverage certain things. And mind you, I just moved into the state, Oklahoma, the same year, really months before I became town manager. So it wasn't like I had built relationships in Oklahoma, but there's a formula, right? So I think that we all as academics or practitioners understand what a formula looks like and then how to recreate that. And to your point, that's what we're trying to see even in Princeville. How do we create a blueprint and then replicate? And at the at the first level, it's all about understanding community needs and then formulating words and understanding that they may not even know how to say at the state level. And having that vulnerability and transparency to say, this community is in dire need, and I don't even know really where to begin in rebuilding Black towns, but I'm here to kind of I'm here as a buffer, right? And members in Black Towns Municipal Management, we're here as buffers to be that middle woman. I like to say middle woman, to be that middle woman of community language, community rhetoric, and what are the needs that they're trying to explain that meets the state level in state language. And I think language right here is one of those big community divides, and translating it into ways in which it's palatable and actionable, and in ways in which we can have big picture ideas, but know at a micro level how to implement those ideas.
Thanks, Simone. Laurie?
A couple of things I'd like to add. Enterprise is one of our business lines is as a community development finance institution. And I would offer that a lot of the funding that comes forward from the federal government comes through states, and there's a lot of tension between states and cities. We see this every day. For political reasons, for economic reasons, the connections are not always made. So the city focus, the city priorities, or the tribal or the rural priorities are not taken into consideration. But here's an important role that everyone needs to understand that CDFIs can play. Community development finance institutions are those local banks, the chartered financial institutions in local communities that can actually deploy financing and funding to communities. So I would offer that CDFIs, which were actually founded to ensure that all communities have access to funding, CDFIs are a really important way to get funding into communities, and CDFIs understand the communities that they're working with because they're in the neighborhood, they're in the local town. They are often the ones providing support for housing, for faith-based institutions, for healthcare efforts, and CDFIs are federally chartered, so they have the due diligence necessary to deploy that funding. But number one, let's think about CDFIs as a network. We also have to think about how to ensure that communities can get shovel ready. You know, there's a lot of great ideas that community leaders may have. We see them in tribes, in rural communities, in cities, and yet there's no redevelopment funding that can come forward to get those projects to be shovel ready. So a lot of the projects that are going to be funded under EJA are going to be the projects that have already received funding to get to a certain stage so they can be ready to go. That is not going to put everyone at the same place. It is not allowing for an equitable distribution of funding. We need to make sure that these ideas are incubated and generated and supported and funded in the pre-development stage. Shovel ready is very different than shovel worthy. So we need to make sure that the funding coming forward to put into projects, right, is not just going to go in to backfill the governor's special pet project, as we saw in New Jersey. The third point I'm going to make is, you know, a lot of renters are going to be at a disadvantage when we talk about funding, because often financing goes to single family homeowners. That puts millions of renters in harm's way, or owners of mobile home manufactured housing, right? Or owners of housing that's not even clear who owns the title, right? We see a lot of that in Puerto Rico. So we need to make sure that we've got set asides and earmarks in the funding coming down from the feds to these particular communities. And one thing, Dan, that, you know, BRIC, as it evolves, needs to also consider is the rental multifamily space. which does provide so much housing. And I would offer this. I'll close by offering this. Renters are at a particular disadvantage when it comes to climate risk because renters depend on landlords to make those decisions for them. I live in a 300-unit building in Brooklyn. It's up to my landlord whether or not we're going to get a new roof or a new boiler or what have you. And we work with a lot of these owners. And so it's really critical that we ensure that we have a special attention paid to renters and landlords so that they have a product that works for them. And this is not always a priority by states. Here's an idea for us to consider. What would it look like to have a help desk for the nation to provide housing support, technical assistance and guidance and pre-development financing to support all of what we just talked about today? Someplace we can go to get that kind of support. Because if it's not there, it's not going to happen.
I like it. And so we're getting close to the end. So I'm just going to throw some stuff out there and then give y'all an opportunity to quickly say whatever you want to in closing, because I think that I'm limited on time here. So one of the things that I used to be the president of the National Emergency Management Association. And I just have to say that some of my colleagues did not seem to be passionate and committed to hazard mitigation, resilience, and equity for same. I mean, it's because they have a lot on their plate. I'm sure their intentions are good, but this has got to be a priority, right? It's got to be a top priority. So how do we get them to be passionate about it? Because these are the ladies and gents that are getting all this money and managing it for all the people across the nation. The other thing I want you to think about is the hazard mitigation BCA discount rate, currently at 7%. It is an effective barrier to the participation of smaller jurisdictions and inherently inequitable. We know that a lot of the smaller jurisdictions are made up of a population that are either socioeconomically disadvantaged or people of color or both. So how can we talk with the federal government about changing the BCA so we can enhance equity in the hazard mitigation program? Another comment I'd like to make is, how can we ensure that technical assistance is available to help these smaller socioeconomically disadvantaged towns get the type of programs and advice that they need to be successful? So these are things that I always think about. When I was director, we created a land bank in partnership with a nonprofit, also in partnership with a credit union, which we would take these old kind of rundown houses and we would renovate them, make them nice, and then make them available to low income renters. As I got to say, low income renters, talk about a housing issue, those folks are really in a bad spot because all these disaster assistance programs, they're not for renters, they're for homeowners. And so anyway, those are some thoughts. And I'm going to give y'all an opportunity to blast away for a couple of minutes each so that we can close out and be generally on time. So Dan, we'll start with you first, sir.
Well, I see we're over time, so I'm just going to pick one of those questions, probably the one I'm best able to answer, which is the discount rate. It perturbed me, saying it nicely, when I was at FEMA, and I said, why don't we change this? Certainly we can change this. And we couldn't. We could not change it because FEMA does not control the discount rate, it's OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget has set that discount rate government-wide, so federal government-wide, and they were absolutely not inclined to make an exception for FEMA, no matter what argument we had. So I wish anybody who is in the federal government who can make that argument and convince OMB, I wish them the best. We were unsuccessful. Maybe there can be some lobbying effort by all of us on the outside now to say it needs to be changed. I will say that I chaired a body at the international level with a bunch of countries at the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development, OECD, on the discount rate. We literally had a conference on discount rates across the globe, and we are among the highest, if not the highest in developed nations. And it is a huge barrier, it is a huge problem. It needs to come down. OMB controls that, full stop.
I'll
Thanks,
jump in
Dan.
here.
Simone, over to you, ma'am.
Yes, and so to answer your first question about at the root, like motivation, right? So how do you motivate? How do you inspire those to have interest in hazard mitigation in rural local communities and what that means? So I have two kind of responses, and it's just seeing it, right? I think that there's power in experience or experiential experiences and going to these communities. And if that's taking kind of those quick road trips and look where they are, see how people are living in resilient communities without really having access, equity, resources. And Dr. Tia Martin and I, so I know that, again, we are kind of in a interesting place in history when it comes to COVID-19 and the pandemic. And so it's just like, we don't really want to go and, of course, travel in that manner. And so Dr. Tia Martin and I are leveraging that digital tool, that digital space of having these digital kind of tours where you're able to feel as if you are part of that community and walking down the street. And so I think that it's kind of leveraging these experience of seeing and believing, understanding how there's a low capacity, low rate of rebuilding. And I think that if it was kind of this in-person or digital space where you can collaborate and understand more from a community level, hopefully that creates that motivation at the top level.
Thanks, Simone. Laurie, close us out and take us home, ma'am.
All right, Mike, I love it. This is dollars and cents argument. We spent $160 billion after Katrina. We spent $80 billion after Sandy. This doesn't even account for all of the pain and suffering and other expenses that went into paying to clean up after these disasters and the legacies that these have left, right? Still have communities in Houston that had to flee their homes after Katrina. When are we going to wake up as a nation and stop hemorrhaging all of this money for cleaning up after disaster, after disaster, after disaster? We've got to get smarter about how we spend our money. And we've got to invest in the communities that are on the front lines of these disasters. Because at the end of the day, this has to be a fiscal responsibility effort. You've got to make sure that equity and resiliency is part of a dollars and cents campaign to make sure that our nation is protected, secure, and equitable, and that all households in this nation have a fair shot at the American dream. So this is, to me, one of the biggest campaigns we need to have as a nation. That's my 2 cents.
Hey, everybody heard it. We
So-
want a fair shot at the American dream.
That's right.
That's what this is about. All right, I want to thank our phenomenal panelists, Laurie, Simone, and Dan. And where are you calling in from, Laurie?
Brooklyn, New York.
So we got New York City, we got Los Angeles, and we got London. What a panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And right now I'll turn it back over to, is it going to be Annie or Katie?
Katie will lead us into the breakout session.
Right.
Yes.
Thank
Thank
y'all.
you all. Amazing panel. Thank you all so much for such knowledge and voices to such pertinent concerns. We're going to go into a little bit of a break here, just a short break, about 7 minutes, and then you'll join back just to the same Zoom meeting if you do end up logging off for a few moments, but I'll leave that meeting room open, and then we'll switch over for those 10 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time breakout sessions. So we'll see you all in a few minutes. Thank you.